We're glad that you're here, and of course we are excited for the beginning of a special series of lessons with a very special brother, Gary Henry, who has been here many, many times. He does not need an introduction to many of us, but Gary lives in the Nashville, Tennessee area. We're very thankful to have him here. We are making available throughout the course of this meeting outlines Gary has graciously made available. Those will be available on the podium outside of the foyer, and they include every lesson except this one. And so you have a copy of Lesson 1 that will actually be delivered during our morning assembly. So I would encourage you just to have your Bibles open and ready to follow along with Gary. We're very glad that he is here. We want to give him as much time as possible, and so if you would bow with me, we will have a word of prayer and then turn our time over to him. Our gracious Father in heaven, thank you so much for this beautiful fall morning with which you have blessed us, and for the health, the freedom that we enjoy that enables us to be here. We thank you for each member who makes up this body. We thank you for your wisdom in providing the church. We thank you for the efforts of all on so many different levels to have an impact for your glory. We thank you for bringing our brother Gary here safely. We thank you for his willingness to come and for the opportunity to hear him expound on the truths and the wisdom of your word. Father, help us to set our minds this week on letting our lights shine so that others may see our good works and give glory to you. We pray that you would be glorified in all of our efforts. We pray that you would be with Gary throughout the next few days. We pray that we would be built up and that much good would be accomplished. We thank you so much for your Son, who has made all of our hope and our efforts possible, and it is through him that we pray this morning. Amen.
A very pleasant good morning to you. It is certainly good to see you again. It's been a while since I've been here. I didn't check my records to see just how long ago we were last together, but it hasn't been too many years. As I've said to you before, you hold the record for having asked me to come for more meetings at this one place than any other place I've ever preached. And I mentioned that to somebody back home last week, and they said, well, that church must not have very much imagination in finding different speakers to come. So I'm not sure what the explanation for that is, but I've enjoyed being the beneficiary of all of that and getting to see you every few years. As Jason indicated, the lesson right now is not exactly going to be a part of the series of lessons on letting our light shine that we'll talk about beginning in the worship hour this morning, but it kind of relates to that. We can easily tie it in. This is a lesson about the importance of understanding that everything we do matters. Every act counts, either for good or for bad. And understanding that really is an important part of having an influence, letting our light shine. And so maybe we can appropriately talk at this point in the study about appreciating the fact that we are able to do some good by letting our light shine. What we do, if we act in the Lord's direction, that does good. The Lord takes what we do and then does with it according to His will and His purposes. Then we need to understand that what we do counts, that our actions do matter. It's an interesting passage that you're very well familiar with at the end of the book of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes chapter 12 at verse 13. The writer said, "Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether it is good or whether it is evil." This passage makes a distinction between good deeds and evil deeds. Most of us understand that there is a distinction to be made between good and evil deeds. We live in an age that tends to blur that distinction. Some people want to say there really is no objective difference between right and wrong, but most of us understand better than that. But it's interesting that in the Scriptures there is not only a distinction between good and evil deeds, but between good and evil people. And that's an even more unpopular distinction to make in the age in which we live. The very last book of the Old Testament, in Malachi, chapter 3, verse 18, the prophet looked ahead to the coming of the day when the Messiah, the Christ, would come. And he said in Malachi 3, verse 18, "Then you shall again discern between the righteous and the wicked, between one who serves God and one who does not serve him." In Malachi's day, they had not made that distinction between those who served the Lord and those who didn't. And the prophet said there'll be coming a day when people will once again distinguish between the righteous and the wicked. So there are some wicked people in the world. But it's interesting to wonder how, if people end up being either righteous or wicked, how do people get to be that way? We don't start out when we're born wicked. So if some people end up being that way, how did it come to be that they ended up in that place? How do people get to be the way they are, whether they are good or evil? Well, I want us to think, first of all, about the fact that our characters, this is true in the good direction and the evil direction, our characters, at least as mature adults, are the accumulation of all of the decisions that we've made that have led up to that point in time. When we don't like the way things are going in life, we're dissatisfied with our state of affairs, it's easy to blame that on circumstances beyond our control, isn't it? We tend to say, well, I could have done better if I'd been dealt a better hand, but I didn't get any good breaks, and so I ended up not having pleasant circumstances. But in the main, we each are the product of decisions that we have made. There certainly are things that can happen that are beyond our control. But our character is not formed by those circumstances. Our character is formed by what we have chosen to do with the circumstances that presented themselves to us. And God gave us a free will with which to decide how we will deal with all the various things that come our way, some of which are pleasant and some of which are unpleasant, but we choose how to respond to those things, and that's what ultimately makes up our character. We have, each of us, voluntarily thought and spoken and done the things that have made us what we are, as we sit here thinking about it this morning. Our personal character, and I'm using the word character to refer to that inner person, the person that we really are, that God sees us to be. Our personal character is not built up from our external circumstances, but from what we've chosen to do with those circumstances. Contrast, for example, David, who was described as being a man after God's own heart, with his predecessor Saul. Remember when Saul became the first king of Israel, he was a very good man. At that point in his life, he had desirable qualities and was selected by God to be the king of Israel. But he began to be unfaithful. And in 1 Samuel chapter 13 and verse 14, notice what it says. Samuel the prophet is talking to him, and he says, "Now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart. The Lord has commanded him to be commander over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." So God said to Saul, "I'm going to find a man who's after my own heart." And that implies that at that point Saul wasn't that kind of man. Even stronger statement over in chapter 15 at verse 28. Samuel said to him, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today," now listen to this, "and has given it to a neighbor of yours who is better than you." Well, that's politically incorrect language, isn't it? To talk about one person being better than another. But Samuel said to Saul, God is taking the kingdom away from you, and he's going to give it to a man who is better. Meaning a man who has a higher caliber of character. A man who has moral qualities that you don't have. So, striking difference between Saul and David, at least at that point in their life, but how did they get to be that way? Did David end up being a man after God's own heart because he had better circumstances? You know, he got better breaks in life? No. David ended up being a better man than Saul because he had made different choices in dealing with the things that had come his way. It wasn't a matter of his circumstances, it was a matter of his choices. Each of us needs to take responsibility for what we have made out of ourselves. There's a sense in which we are each a self-made person. I think sometimes if we make some great accomplishment in life, we take all the credit for that ourselves. We forget to remember that all of us have had a lot of help to accomplish the things that we have accomplished. But when it comes to our character, that's the result of choices that we have made that we need to take responsibility for. Paul says in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 7 that we will reap what we have sown. When the time comes for some verdict to be pronounced by God upon our character for good or for evil, whether we are a person who has turned in God's direction or we have turned away from Him, that verdict will be on the basis of deeds that we have done in the body, choices that we have made, and we need to accept responsibility for those choices. Now, the thing about choices and decisions is that they have a cumulative effect. You notice I said on the chart that our character is the accumulation of the choices that we made, and that makes it an even stronger statement. Here's a choice that I made early in life, and then after that I made another choice, and another choice, and another choice, and all these choices and decisions are kind of like snowflakes that are getting added to a snowball that gets bigger and bigger and bigger as it rolls along, and one little snowflake gets added to it, another little snowflake gets added to it. None of those snowflakes in and of themselves are very big, but if you accumulate enough of them together, you've got something much bigger than you would have ever figured if you just looked at one of those little snowflakes. And so that's the way it is with choices. Some of them in and of themselves don't look to be very significant. But when you start putting all of those together, you get a snowball rolling either in a good direction or a bad direction. Either it's going toward God or it's going away from God. And it's the cumulative result of all of those decisions as one choice gets added to another choice and another choice. And first thing you know, a character has developed. It's either like David, after God's own heart, or like Saul, turned very rebelliously and disobediently away from God. And so what that means is that even little choices are significant because every choice we make gets stuck to the snowball that's growing with all of these decisions. Every decision you make changes you a little bit, either for better or for worse. Every decision that you make that involves saying yes to what you know of God's will changes you a little bit better in God's direction. Every time you say no to God, I don't care how insignificant you think that thing is, every time you say no to God, you harden your heart just a little bit more. You take just one more step away from God, and you make it all that much harder for you ever to say yes in the future. You see, the choices that we're going to have to make in the future, and some of them may be big choices, those big life-changing decisions that have to be made. Those decisions will have to be made by a person who has been shaped and formed by all of the decisions that have led up to that point. With every one of even the slightest deeds that we engage in, we are building up a character that will find it progressively more easy to act in certain ways and more difficult to act in other ways. You remember the statement that's made about Daniel in Daniel, the 6th chapter, when Daniel had his lion's den test, an edict was passed making it illegal to pray. And Daniel had been praying all his life. So what did he do on that day when now it's illegal to pray? Well, he went home and prayed, didn't he? Well, I don't know if you've ever stopped to figure up the chronology of Daniel, but Daniel was a very aged man in chapter 6 when that test came upon him. He may have been 80 or 90 years of age. for all I know. And so in verse 10 it says, when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home, and in his upper room, and with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days. That's significant. He did on that day what he had been doing for a long time before that. He faced a serious test that day. On that day when now it's illegal to pray on pain of death, you've got a difficult decision to make, whether you're going to pray that day with your windows open just like you always have. So a difficult choice, but it was made considerably easier for Daniel because he had been practicing that decision all his life by saying yes in similar situations. Now he will find it much easier to do the right thing than a person who had been practicing doing wrong for 90 years. A person who had been saying no for 90 years now faces that same test. That person is going to find it much harder to do what Daniel did because Daniel had a different character. A different kind of person had resulted from 90 years of Daniel making good choices. And so now that character came in handy on a day when he needed to do a difficult thing. He found it easier to say yes to God's will than he would have had he grown a different kind of character by saying no to God over all of those years. None of us is standing still. With every decision we make, we're moving either a little bit closer to God or a little bit farther away from Him. That's a sobering thought, isn't it? In John chapter 8, verses 44 and 47, Jesus went so far as to say that the Jewish leaders that he was confronting, who didn't believe that he was the Christ, he said, you are of your father, the devil. That's why you don't believe in me. You are of the devil rather than of God. You listen to the devil's voice rather than God's voice. Well, that's a strong statement, that these were children of the devil, but they didn't get to be that way overnight. They got to be that way a little bit at a time, one choice at a time, until first thing you know, a rebellious, wicked character had developed in those persons. They weren't that way when they were children. They got to be that way by these decisions accumulating till after a while it could truly be said that they were children of the devil. So that's sobering to think about. With every choice I make, if it's a choice to say no to God, that hardens my heart a little bit and will make it much more difficult tomorrow for me to do the right thing. And ultimately, God's going to take every choice we've made into His accounting, His judging of our lives. In Matthew chapter 12 and verse 36, Jesus said, I say to you that for every idle word men may speak, they will give account for it in the day of judgment. There's no decision that you've ever made that's too small for God to consider. You may have considered it a small decision, but there's no tidbit of information that won't be brought into the courtroom when the time comes for God's accounting to be made. You know, when we're children on the playground, we do something that turns out badly, we have a tendency to say, well, I didn't mean that. I had my fingers crossed. That didn't count. Well, that won't work at judgment, will it? For us to say, well, Lord, I didn't mean that. I had my fingers crossed. You can't take that into consideration in your judgment of me. No, everything, it will be fair to be brought into God's judgment. No excuses will be accepted. We may think sometimes we're just being careless or haphazard or we just weren't thinking, but that's the problem. You stand before the Lord in the judgment day in a lost condition. You die in rebellion against Him. And the Lord says, well, Gary, what about this over here? And what about that? And if Gary says, well, I know that wasn't the best, but Lord, I wasn't deliberately trying to be wicked. I wasn't thinking. The Lord would say, you should have been thinking. That's the problem. You weren't thinking when you should have been thinking. You made a bad choice just by default. You let circumstances happen that could have been different if you had made different choices. Hell is not going to be just some arbitrary punishment of God for some people. Hell will be the destination that people will reach who've chosen to go that direction, one little choice at a time. And in the judgment, in effect, what's going to happen is God simply giving each person the choice that they have made. If I stand before the Lord in a lost condition on the judgment day, the Lord will be able to say to me, Gary, I did everything I could to change your mind. I pleaded with you to come back my direction. I gave my son to make it possible for you to be forgiven of your sins. I begged you. I did everything I could to persuade you to come back my way, but you persisted in saying no, no, no until your time ran out. You died in your rebellion. You refused to have anything to do with me, so depart from me. I'll give you your decision in the matter. Depart from me forever. I'll never bother you ever again. Hell is going to be the end of a road that we are traveling right now with our decisions. If our decisions are saying no to God, then we're traveling a path that one day is going to reach its culmination if we stay on that road. There's only one place that road can go to. There's only one kind of character that can result if we again and again and again say no to God. There's a sense in which those who will be lost will be those who have demanded to be lost, despite everything God could do to try to persuade them to change their minds. There will be people who in the judgment day will be lost because they came to be wicked people and they refused the help that God wanted to give them to try to change and become good people. But they refused that. They said no to it. And so hell will be the result of that snowball going down and down and down until finally they were eternally lost. So there are wicked people in the world right now. Some of whom are probably sitting in this room. If we could know everything about everybody in the room as God knows it to be, what we would see is that some of the people in this room have hearts that have turned in God's direction and have accepted God's forgiveness, and they're making choices that say yes to God. Others, despite the appearance of their physical bodies at the assemblies of this church now and then, if we could see what God sees about their hearts, would see a different character, turned away from God. Eternity will show the difference. Eternity, all of the information will be plain and open and clear, and then it will be time for destinies to be pronounced. Robert Louis Stevenson said one time, sooner or later we must all sit down to a banquet of consequences. Sooner or later, the consequences of this accumulation of choices that we've made, sooner or later is going to catch up with us. And we'll receive the eternal result of that, either condemnation or glory. We will reap what we have sown. I doubt there are very many wicked people in the world who decided when they were children that they wanted to be wicked. That's just not the way it works, you know. Little Johnny's over here playing on the playground, and somebody says, what do you want to do when you grow up? And he says, I want to be a wicked person. Not many people set out to be wicked, but there are many wicked people in the world as God sees. You know, there's no in between. As God sees our character, we're either turned in His direction or turned away from Him. There's no middle ground. You say yes to God or no to Him. We're either lost or saved. And I would go so far as to venture to say that there are more wicked people in the world than there are good people, as God sees things. How did all those wicked people get to be that way? They didn't set out to follow that path. They got there little by little by little, making decisions that at the time they didn't think made any great amount of difference one way or the other. When those little decisions began to accumulate, a character began to appear. It was far worse than what they would have ever thought could have happened when they were just considering these little choices that they thought didn't make much difference. So ultimately, you put all of them together, resulted in a character that was turned away from God. So it is dangerous, it is detrimental ever to say no to God. even once. The Hebrew writer says in Hebrews 12, verse 25, see that you do not refuse him who speaks. Serious thing to say no to God. I was thinking the other day, wondering how many sermons I've preached this year. I don't know. I could go back and count them up. But it's been a lot. This week, for me, will be the 7th in a string of 7 meetings in a row. I get to go home from this meeting. I'll be home for the rest of the year. A lot of sermons. I've stood in front of a lot of audiences while the invitation song was being sung. I've looked into a lot of faces where somebody was making a decision. Will I say yes to what I know God would want me to do? Or will I one more time say no, just like I've been saying no for a long while? Sometimes you see people struggling. Sometimes you can see by the expression on people's face that they know they need to respond to the gospel. Maybe they've never even become a Christian, and they know that they need to respond to the gospel and receive the forgiveness of their sins. But they've procrastinated it so often in the past. They're struggling with whether to say yes now, and it's become hard because they've been saying no for quite some time. And the momentum is going away from God, and so you see them struggling. As I look into people's faces during the invitation, it just pains me to see them struggling to overcome their better impulses. They know what they should do, but they're fighting against it. And the invitation song ends, and they have successfully resisted the urge to do what's right once more. They have said no one more time. And the next time they have to make a decision about whether to say yes to God or not, it'll be even harder because they've taken one more step away from God. They've added a little bit to their character. They've changed themselves just a little bit more into a hardened character that is rebelling against God. And it'll be harder the next time to say yes. Not impossible. It's never impossible as long as life lasts. If we grow a character that's in the habit of saying no to God, the more we do that, the harder it will be eventually to change our minds and say yes. So that is very sobering. But I want to end on a more encouraging note. If it's sobering to think that every act counts in God's judgment of us and His accounting of us, it's also encouraging to think that every act counts. Sometimes get into desperate situations, don't we? Difficult circumstances. And sometimes it looks so bad that we say, well, it's just hopeless. I've dug the hole so deep, there's nothing I can do now that's going to change it. But that's never really true, is it? It's never really true to say that we're in a hopeless or a helpless situation, because there is always something that we can do. Just as every act in rebellion against God hardens us a little bit more, every choice to say yes, even in some small matter, changes us a little bit in that direction. In spiritual matters, there's no such thing as a stalemate between God and the devil. The forces of God are always stronger. We need to have the youthful optimism of David as a young man, when his father sent him to the army camp to bring some provisions for his older brothers who were in the army. And David got there in 1 Samuel 17 and found that there was a standoff between the armies of Israel and the armies of the Philistines. And David said, what is going on here? And they said, well, the Philistines every day are sending their champion, Goliath, out to taunt us and make fun of us and challenge us to send somebody out to fight him. And there's nobody in the army of Israel that would go out there and fight Goliath. So we're at a standoff. David couldn't believe it. He knew that there's always something somebody could do. So he said, well, I'll go out of there and fight him. Nobody else will. And he did and won the victory on that day. David understood that there's always something that can be done, and if we'll do it, it'll make a difference. It's never right to say, this is hopeless. There's always some right choice that we could make in God's direction. I always try to tell my boys, it does good to do good. You see you've dug yourself into a hole, quit digging immediately, and at that moment say, I'm now going to start making better choices. And every little choice I make in God's direction will make a difference for good, because every act counts. Every act counts for good, as well as evil acts count. We can always act in the faith that if we'll take that tiny step that's right in front of us, it may not seem like it's much, but if we will do the thing that's right in front of us that is capable of being done, that it will alter the situation, maybe in ways that we can't even see right now. Everything we do, however little it may seem to be, makes a difference for good. Remember in Mark chapter 12, when Jesus was sitting in the temple observing the people putting money into the treasury in the temple, and he saw this widow who came and put in just 2 of the smallest coins that they had, the 2 mites. And Jesus said, she's put in more than all the rest of them. Well, what do you mean by that? Not literally. Some of them put in greater amounts of money than she had, but he said she has done what she could. She couldn't give a big amount, but she could give a little amount. And when she did that, she did the thing that was possible for her to do, and it made a great difference. Jesus had high praise for her because she did what she could do. She took the little step that she was capable of making. God never requires steps that are bigger than we can take. You just won't ever be in a situation where there's some step that you need to take, but it's an impossible step. The step that God wants you to take is always takeable. You can take that step, and when we do that, when we make the choice to say yes to what's right, it makes a difference for good. Sometimes, if we could see everything that God sees, when we see how He takes some little choice that we made seem so insignificant at the time, but God took that, and maybe years later, God did something with that was far beyond what we ever would have imagined, simply because we said yes in a small moment, seemingly small, to what we know we should do and what we could do. So heaven is going to be the outcome if we learn to choose actions that are headed in God's direction. So it's both sobering and encouraging to remember that every act counts. In the context of these lessons that we're going to think about this week, about letting our light shine, we need to keep that in mind. Some of the things we're going to think about this week may seem small. Like, well, if I do that, that's not going to let very much light shine. Who am I? I can't have any influence. But every one of these things will be things that every one of us can do, and when we do them, we need to understand that that counts for good. It does make a difference. Whether we ever live to see the difference that it makes or not, God will take even small things that we do and do His will with them. So life is serious business. It pays to live carefully, as Paul said in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 15. See that you walk carefully or circumspectly. Watch out the decisions that you make. Let's be sobered by the fact that every action reaches out into eternity, and we're going to have to take responsibility for even the little bad choices that we made. But on the other hand, let's be encouraged to know that we can make a difference for good, even in these little things that we're going to talk about this week in letting our light shine. In everything, let's be grateful for the opportunity that we've got because we're sitting here alive today with still a free will that can make choices. Let's be thankful for the fact that today we've got the chance to make better choices than we've ever made in the past before. That's all the more important if we've been making bad choices in the past. We've got the chance today to reverse that direction and start making better choices than what we've made in the past. That's what Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 9 and 10, when he said, I'm not worthy to be an apostle. I persecuted the church. But by the grace of God, I am what I am. And Paul was spending the rest of his life saying thank you for the chance to start making better choices than what he used to make. So let's seize the opportunity this week to think about some ways that we can make better choices, and let's make them. It'll do good if we will. All right, that's enough for our Bible study period this morning, and we'll begin the series on letting our light shine here in just a little bit. Thank you.